The book came out in 2011, and then about 7 years later, they ended up making a film about it. It was directed by this guy called Steven Spielberg, supposedly some big hotshot Hollywood director. You may have heard of him. He's done this film called, what, Jaws? Schindler's List? Jurassic Park? Maybe? So the hopes were high that this film would be pretty sick, and Rotten Tomatoes has it down as like 71% right now. I don't know how. It's not 71. It's at best an 11. And there's times when I've seen films on Rotten Tomatoes that are really low, and I'm like, that's actually quite good. This is the opposite of that. The film was not so great. The book is what you want to read. It's probably the second best book I have ever read. It's definitely the best sci-fi novel. I'm not a huge sci-fi fan, but this, like, back when it came out in 2011, was all the rage. I was a teenager at the time, and like every teenager that was kind of into books seemed to be reading it. Well, my parents never got me, and so I basically never read it until I got to a certain age where I had my own cash, and I was like, I'll give this a shot. I think I was 20 when I read it, and it was still like, hit the spot just right. So the book, as you can see, has a bunch of stacks. It's got this one little character right there. Isn't that cute? This, I presume, is going to be our main character, Wade, or his avatar's name, Parzival, however you say that. Basically, Wade lives in the 2040s when the resources, I think predominantly energy and electricity, have basically dried up quite a lot, and people end up living, for the most part, in different districts, and most of them live in these stacks where they basically have caravans stacked on top of each other. Now, what makes me want to read this book, what makes anyone want to read this book, is the fact that people can get away from this new, even more poverty, overwhelmed Earth than the one we have right now, through what's called the Oasis. The Oasis is basically just a virtual reality world, a little bit like a more successful version of what Mark Zuckerberg wants to do with the metaverse and whatnot. They can basically get away and live in like a virtual reality world, and a lot of people, the same way people might get like fall into alcoholism, fall into like a virtual reality version of that, where they just only want to live in there. Now, this novel was written by Ernest Cline. He's only written one other novel after this. This was his first one. The second one is called Armada, and then he also wrote Ready Player 2, but the less said about that, the better. Now, the story goes that the creator of the Oasis, James Halliday, ends up passing away at a certain point, either at the start of the book or before the book begins shortly, and upon his death, in his will, he basically announces that he's laying these challenges or Easter eggs throughout the Oasis, which is almost a bit like No Man's Sky. There's just infinite worlds on and on and on. The book goes back and references a lot of 80s pop culture, films like Back to the Future, Dungeons and Dragons, things like that, which are all pretty cool. Like, I'm not one of those guys who's like an absolute sucker for everything in the 80s, but this is a pretty good ode to the 80s, so to say, because that is when the creator, James Halliday, grew up, and of course Ernest Cline as well, who must be about 50 or something like that now. And so the story goes that there is one egg hidden in the Oasis for someone to find. To find the egg, they need to find 3 different keys, which are big challenges, and no one for the first few years can seem to find a single one. There's a scoreboard that everyone can access so that someone gets a certain number of points. If you get an Easter egg, if you get it first, you'll get a certain number of points. If you get it second, you'll get a bit less. If you were first to get the first egg and third to get the second egg, you might be second in the overall rankings and things like that. But for a very long time, a number of years, no one can find them. It's really hard. People are hired or labeled themselves as Gunters, I think that's how you pronounce it. And their whole job is to try and find these keys to find the Easter egg, because if you find the Easter egg, then you basically end up owning the Oasis. That is Halliday's stipulation in his will. Of course, 18-year-old Wade, also known as Parzival, ends up reading through Halliday's almanac, which is available. It's basically like a sort of journal recipe cookbook for the Oasis that's freely available to everyone. And he deciphers one of the riddles in there, and he goes through a certain number of challenges inspired by different 80s pop culture movies and shows and things like that. And he ends up being the first one to get the first egg, which puts his name, his avatar's name, not his real world name, up there for the whole world to see. And now this is like the biggest thing. Now there's been a change in the scoreboard for the first time in years. And the story goes on and on. Wade, along with his friends that he doesn't actually know in real life, he knows them kind of like the way a lot of people do when they're gaming. They know their gamer tag, and he basically helps them to complete the trial because everyone needs to do it individually. One of them is called Artemis, one of them is called H. One of them's called Shoto. They're from different parts of the world. He has a bit of a perhaps a brooding, loving relationship with this person called Artemis, who they believe to be a woman. You don't know because they just have their avatar which is dressed up, but you don't know who's behind the screen. Parzival or Wade gets past the first gate. This whole corporate government organization called IOI, I believe it is, basically tries to get and hire Wade to join them, to let them get through the first gate so they can get closer to winning that. So they basically say, we'll give you this certain amount of money or power if you help us get all the way. He basically says no, and they end up finding where he's staying in the stacks, and they try to bomb the place. Wade and his friends are trying to get there all the way till the end so it doesn't fall into the hands of the likes of this big corporation called IOI or any other gunters who might be able to beat them to it. So yeah, the best part about this book, for sure, you've got that whole journey of them trying to find the eggs, and it's kind of fun. Like, they go through different stages. It's almost like the book is cut up into these 3 different acts to find the introduction and then the 3 different keys to get to the eventual egg. But I would say the sort of interactions between the characters, who are basically like teenagers gaming together, if you believe that they are teenagers, and all the pop culture references that they need to go through, a lot of them are involved in the challenges and finding out and working out the riddles. It basically seems to be, if you know more about the 80s and that period of time, then you have the best chance of finding all of the keys and the eggs eventually. Now Wade's obviously 18, so he had been born in like 2020 something, but he goes back and reads a lot because there's a lot of information available on the Oasis and throughout the worlds that are in the Oasis to find out what you need to know. So I can't imagine there's been many reviews of this of late. Probably been more reviews for the movie in the last few years. But I would say, even as someone who is an adult, not just a teenager, that it was still a really enjoyable book. Like I said, I'm not a huge sci-fi fan specifically, but this is still one of the best books I've ever read. Because it's sold, it'll be up for a few pounds on eBay or something like that. You might be able to get it in a library because it'll be quite famous and I imagine fairly available. But this is definitely something, you know, you should read. If you do like this book, like I said, Ernest Cline's next novel is called Armada, and he also did Ready Player 2. In my opinion, not so good. I'm not going to be doing a review on either of those two, but it's along the same sort of lines. Young teenage boy goes off on an adventure, and obviously Ready Player 2 is a sequel to Ready Player 1 after the events of it. I won't go through the whole thing and spoil it for you, but it is one of the few books that I think that I would read again, and I don't really envision myself reading a lot of books twice, because I'm like, I read it once, it takes a long time, I'll keep it, I like it, I'll give it to people that I know, because I'm like, you should definitely read this. But this might be one of the ones that I actually go back to at some point in the future. If you want to read the audiobook, Will Wheaton, the guy who stars in Stand By Me as a little kid, and he's in The Big Bang Theory quite a lot, he does the audiobook for that, so that's kind of cool. And it's only like 15 hours long. The paperback is like 350 pages. There's a fair few words per page, but it does not feel like a strain whatsoever. It was a really enjoyable read back when I read it. So I could say this is for sci-fi fans. I could say this is for young adults. But as someone who read it in their 20s, you know, I think for potentially an older generation who perhaps grew up in like the 70s, 80s, 90s, you could get a huge kick out of this and going back and reliving a lot of those memories that you might have had as a younger person, because it references a lot of big movies and video games that they use to try and figure out different parts of the clues that are needed to get towards the keys and then the egg. I mean, there's 350 pages of it, and I would say there's like a brand new reference every couple of pages, and then they go back to old ones, so it is a constant sort of thing, and that is one of the best parts of the book. And we can kind of all relate to that sort of virtual reality world. We don't all have virtual reality headsets. I don't have one in here, but I feel like more and more people are slowly going to get into that as time goes on, and it'll become perhaps more and more relevant. For all I know, in the 2040, this is what we could be doing, living in caravans stacked on top of each other and hoping to, you know, go to another world and scroll through the 2040 version of TikTok all day. Who knows? But hopefully by that time, they might be making better movies of the books, because the movie kind of sucked ass. But the book's good, so go and read it.